I never thought I'd be the kind of woman who would let someone die. But sitting in that hospital waiting room, watching my husband's face go pale as the doctor delivered the news that would change everything, I felt something cold and final settle in my chest. He needed a kidney. My kidney. The same kidney that belonged to the woman he'd abandoned 3 years ago with 2 young children and a mortgage we couldn't afford. The irony wasn't lost on me. It never is it? Life has this twisted sense of humor that makes you wonder if someone upstairs is orchestrating these moments just to see what we're really made of when pushed to our absolute limit. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning, from the morning that shattered my world so completely that I'm still finding pieces of myself in the most unexpected places. It was a Tuesday in October when I found the letter. Not a love letter, though in a sick way I suppose it was. David had always been methodical about his lies, and his farewell was no different. The envelope was cream-colored, expensive paper that he'd probably bought specifically for this purpose. My name was written across the front in his careful handwriting, Rachel, like he was addressing a business proposal rather than the woman who'd shared his bed for 12 years. I remember the weight of it in my hands. Such a light thing to carry the destruction of everything I'd built my life around. Emma, our 8-year-old, was eating cereal at the kitchen table, milk dribbling down her chin as she focused intently on the cartoon playing on her tablet. Sam, our 6-year-old, was under the table trying to feed Cheerios to our dog, Max, who was wagging his tail with the kind of unbridled joy that only comes from not understanding that your world is about to implode. "Mommy, why are you shaking?" Emma's voice cut through the fog in my head. I looked down at my hands. She was right. The letter was trembling like a leaf in a storm, and I realized my entire body was vibrating with something I couldn't name yet. Fear, maybe. Or the kind of dread that comes when you know you're about to read something that will change everything forever. "I'm fine, sweetheart," I lied, my voice surprisingly steady. "Just cold." But I wasn't cold. The kitchen was warm, filled with morning sunlight and the smell of coffee and the comfortable chaos of a family getting ready for another ordinary day. What I was feeling was something much worse than cold. I was feeling the first tremors of an earthquake that was about to split my life right down the middle. I tore open the envelope with shaking fingers, and David's words spilled out like poison onto the page. "Rachel, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. I know this isn't fair, and I know you'll hate me for doing it this way, but I can't keep pretending anymore. Sarah and I are in love, and we're starting a new life together in Portland. I've already submitted my resignation at the firm, and I'll be staying with her until I can figure out what comes next. I know you'll want to fight this, to try to make me come back, but my mind is made up. I haven't been happy for a long time, Rachel. We both know our marriage has been over for years. We've just been going through the motions for the kids' sake, and that's not fair to any of us. I've left money in the checking account to cover this month's expenses, and I'll set up a support arrangement once I get settled. I'll call the kids when I'm ready to explain things to them. Please don't try to contact me right away. I need time to figure out how to be the father they deserve while building the life I need. David." The letter fluttered to the floor like a dying bird, and I stared at it for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Sarah. Sarah from his office, the paralegal with the perfect smile and the laugh that was just a little too loud whenever David told his stupid jokes at the company Christmas parties. Sarah, who was 28 years old and had no stretch marks, no crow's feet, no history of sleepless nights with colicky babies or worried conversations about mortgage payments. Sarah, who got the best version of my husband while I got a letter. The thing about betrayal is that it doesn't hit you all at once. It comes in waves, each one more devastating than the last. The first wave was shock, the kind that makes your vision tunnel and your ears ring like you've been slapped. The second wave was disbelief, my mind scrambling to find some other explanation for what I'd just read. Maybe this was a joke. Maybe David was having some kind of breakdown. Maybe Sarah was blackmailing him somehow. But the third wave was recognition, and that's the one that nearly brought me to my knees right there in the kitchen with my children eating breakfast just a few feet away, because suddenly, all the pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. The late nights at the office that had started 6 months ago, the way he'd been looking at his phone with a secret smile, the sudden interest in working out, in buying new clothes, in cologne that smelled nothing like the aftershave he'd worn for the past decade, the way he'd stopped touching me. Not just sexually, though that had dried up months ago, but all of it. No more absent-minded kisses when he left for work. No more hands on my shoulders when he passed behind my chair at dinner. No more reaching for me in his sleep, the unconscious connection that had been the foundation of our physical relationship since we were young and stupid and thought love was enough to conquer anything. "Mommy?" Emma's voice seemed to come from very far away. "You're crying." I touched my face and my fingers came away wet. When had I started crying? I couldn't remember. The tears felt foreign on my cheeks, like they belonged to someone else. "I'm okay, baby," I managed, though my voice cracked on the words. "Just something in my eye." But Emma was 8, not stupid. She slid off her chair and wrapped her small arms around my waist, pressing her face against my stomach. "Is Daddy sick?" she asked, and the innocence in her voice nearly undid me completely. "Daddy." God, how was I going to explain this to them? How do you tell your children that their father has chosen to disappear from their lives like they never mattered at all? How do you explain that the man who taught them to ride bikes and read them bedtime stories and promised them he'd always be there had decided that his happiness was more important than their security? "No, sweetheart," I whispered into her hair. "Daddy's not sick." But I was. I was sick with rage and heartbreak and a kind of disbelief that made me wonder if I was losing my mind. 12 years of marriage, 2 beautiful children, a home we'd built together, literally. David had spent weekends for 2 years renovating this house, turning it from a fixer-upper into something we were proud of. Family vacations and inside jokes and the slow, comfortable intimacy that comes from really knowing someone. And he'd thrown it all away for a 28-year-old paralegal with perfect teeth and no responsibilities. The next few hours passed in a blur of numbness, punctuated by moments of sharp, breathtaking pain. I called in sick to work, unable to imagine sitting through meetings and pretending to care about quarterly reports when my entire world had just collapsed. I dropped the kids off at school, kissing them goodbye with the desperate intensity of someone who suddenly understood how fragile everything really was. Then I came home to the house that suddenly felt like a mausoleum and tried to figure out what the hell I was supposed to do next. I called David's office first, some part of me still hoping this was all a mistake, that maybe he'd just been having a breakdown and would come to his senses. But his assistant, not Sarah, thankfully, I don't think I could have handled hearing her voice, confirmed that he'd cleaned out his office the night before and submitted his resignation effective immediately. I tried his cell phone next, my hands shaking as I dialed the number I knew by heart. It went straight to voicemail, and his familiar voice telling me to leave a message sent me into a sobbing fit so violent that I had to hang up and run to the bathroom to throw up. That's when it really hit me. The finality of it. David hadn't just left me. He'd evaporated from our lives like he'd never existed at all. No forwarding address. No way to reach him except through lawyers who would charge me money I didn't have to communicate with a man who'd abandoned his family. The money. Oh God, the money. I stumbled to the computer and logged into our online banking, my heart pounding as the pages loaded. David had been true to his word about leaving money for the month's expenses, but seeing the balance made my stomach drop. $3,000. That was what he thought was sufficient to cover a mortgage, utilities, groceries, and everything else for a family of 3. Our mortgage alone was $2,200 a month. I sat there staring at the screen, trying to do math that wouldn't add up no matter how many times I recalculated it. My salary as a junior accountant at a small firm was decent, but it had always been supplementary to David's income as a corporate lawyer. We'd built our lifestyle around 2 incomes, and now I was looking at losing the house within a few months. The house where Emma had taken her first steps. The house where Sam had learned to ride his bike in the driveway, David running behind him with one hand on the seat until that magical moment when he let go and Sam kept riding. The house where we'd hosted birthday parties and Christmas mornings and all the small, precious moments that make up a family's history. David had stolen that from us too. That's when the numbness started to crack, and underneath it was something I'd never felt before. Not just anger. Anger was too small a word for what was building in my chest. This was rage, pure and cold and so intense it felt like it might burn me up from the inside. He'd planned this. That's what made it so much worse. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision or a midlife crisis that got out of hand. David had methodically planned the destruction of our family. He'd found an apartment in Portland. He'd found a new job, because you don't just move across the country without employment lined up when you're a lawyer with a mortgage and 2 kids. He'd probably been planning this for months while kissing me goodnight and helping with homework and sitting across from me at dinner, talking about our weekend plans. All of it had been lies. Not just the affair, but every moment of our lives together for God knows how long. Every "I love you," and every plan we'd made for the future, and every time he'd looked me in the eye and smiled while secretly counting down the days until he could escape. I found myself walking through the house like a detective at a crime scene, looking for clues I'd missed. His closet was indeed empty, not just of clothes, but of the expensive watch his father had given him for our wedding, the cologne I'd bought him for Christmas, even the ratty old college sweatshirt he'd worn every weekend for the past 5 years. He'd taken everything that mattered to him and left behind only the things that belonged to the life he was discarding. In his bedside drawer, I found the wedding ring he'd worn for 12 years. He'd left it sitting there like a piece of junk jewelry, worthless and forgotten. I picked it up and turned it over in my hands, reading the inscription we'd chosen together. Forever and always. The words blurred as tears started falling again, but this time they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of rage. Forever and always. What a joke. What a stupid, naive joke. I don't remember making the decision to call my sister. I just found myself with the phone pressed to my ear, listening to it ring while I paced the kitchen like a caged animal. "Rachel?" Lisa's voice was concerned. "Aren't you supposed to be at work?" "He left," I said, and my voice sounded strange and flat even to my own ears. "David left, this morning." There was a letter. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for so long I thought the call had dropped. Finally, Lisa spoke, and her voice was carefully controlled in the way it got when she was furious and trying not to show it. "What do you mean he left?" So I told her everything. The letter, the money, the empty closet, the wedding ring left behind like trash. I told her about Sarah and Portland, and the way David had simply erased himself from our lives like we were an inconvenience he was tired of dealing with. When I finished, Lisa was quiet for another long moment. Then she said, "I'm coming over." "You don't have to." "I'm coming over," she repeated, and there was something in her voice that reminded me why David had never particularly liked my sister. Lisa had always seen through his charm to something harder underneath, and she'd never been afraid to say so. "And Rachel? Don't do anything stupid while I'm on my way." After she hung up, I sat in my empty kitchen and wondered what she meant by stupid. What could I possibly do that would be more stupid than what David had already done to us? But as I sat there in the silence, surrounded by the debris of my demolished life, I started to understand. The rage that had been building in my chest was looking for an outlet, and Lisa was worried I might do something rash. Call David's parents, maybe, or show up at his office and make a scene. Contact Sarah and tell her exactly what kind of man she'd stolen from his family. The funny thing was, none of those options even occurred to me. What I was feeling was too big for public scenes or dramatic confrontations. This required something more surgical, more precise. David had calculated the destruction of our family with cold efficiency, and something in me was already starting to calculate a response that matched his energy. I just didn't know what that response would be yet. Lisa arrived 40 minutes later with a bag of groceries and the kind of grim determination that had gotten both of us through our mother's death 5 years earlier. She took one look at me sitting at the kitchen table with David's wedding ring still clutched in my fist and immediately went into crisis management mode. "Okay," she said, setting the groceries on the counter with more force than necessary. "First things first. Have you eaten anything today?" I tried to remember. Had I eaten breakfast? I couldn't recall. Time had become strange and elastic since reading David's letter, stretching and compressing in ways that made no sense. "I don't think so," I admitted. "Right. Food first, then we're going to figure out what you need to do to protect yourself and the kids." She started pulling things out of the bag: sandwich meat, bread, fruit, milk. Practical things for people who still needed to eat and live and function even when their worlds had exploded. "Have you talked to a lawyer yet?" "It's been 4 hours, Lisa." "That's 4 hours too long." She was making sandwiches with the kind of aggressive efficiency that meant she was channeling her anger into action. "David's had months to plan this, Rachel. Months to set up his new life and figure out how to screw you over financially. You need to catch up fast." The sandwich she put in front of me looked like cardboard, but I forced myself to take a bite. My sister was right, as usual. While I'd been sitting here crying and raging and trying to process the emotional devastation, David was probably already steps ahead of me legally and financially. I don't even know where to start, I said around the bite of sandwich that felt like sawdust in my mouth. I do. Lisa pulled out her phone and started scrolling through contacts. My friend Janet went through a nasty divorce 3 years ago. Her lawyer was a shark, exactly what you need right now. While she made phone calls, I sat there trying to wrap my head around the practicalities of my new reality. Divorce, custody battles, child support that might or might not actually materialize. The possibility of losing the house, of having to uproot Emma and Sam from the only home they'd ever known. And underneath all of that, the question that was eating at me like acid: how could he do this to them? I could understand David falling out of love with me. Marriages end, people change, it happens. But Emma and Sam? They were innocent in all of this. They were perfect and sweet, and they worshipped their father with the kind of uncomplicated love that only children can give. How do you just walk away from that? Okay, Lisa said, hanging up the phone. Janet's lawyer can see you tomorrow at 2. Her name is Patricia Hawkins, and according to Janet, she eats men like David for breakfast. I nodded, though the thought of sitting in a lawyer's office talking about dividing up the pieces of my marriage made me feel sick. But Lisa was right. I needed to protect my children, even if I couldn't protect myself. What about work? I asked suddenly. I can't keep calling in sick forever, but I don't know how I'm going to sit through meetings and pretend everything's normal. You don't have to pretend everything's normal, Lisa said gently. You just have to function. There's a difference. Function, right. I could do that maybe. Put one foot in front of the other, take care of my kids, figure out how to survive this. But even as I nodded agreement, I could feel something harder crystallizing in my chest. Something that went beyond just survival or functioning or picking up the pieces. David thought he could just erase us from his life like we'd never mattered. He thought he could start over with his young girlfriend while leaving his children to wonder why Daddy didn't love them enough to stay. He thought $3,000 was adequate compensation for 12 years of marriage and 2 beautiful kids and a life we'd built together. He was wrong. I didn't know how yet, but somehow, someday, David was going to understand exactly what he'd thrown away. And more than that, he was going to pay for it. The rest of that day passed in a haze of phone calls and practical conversations that felt surreal. Lisa helped me contact the school to let them know about the family situation. A euphemism that made me want to laugh and cry at the same time. We called my boss to explain why I'd need some flexibility over the next few weeks. We started a list of all the financial accounts I'd need to protect and all the legal documents I'd need to gather. Through it all, I felt like I was watching someone else's life. This couldn't be my reality. Just that morning, I'd been a married woman with a stable home and a predictable future. Now I was a single mother facing potential bankruptcy and homelessness, trying to figure out how to tell my children that their father had decided they weren't worth staying for. When it was time to pick up the kids from school, Lisa offered to come with me, but I said no. This was something I needed to face alone. Emma and Sam were going to look at me with their bright, trusting faces and ask where Daddy was, and I was going to have to find some way to answer that wouldn't destroy them. The drive to the school was the longest 5 minutes of my life. I kept rehearsing different approaches in my head, trying to find words that would soften the blow. But how do you soften something like this? How do you explain abandonment to children who've never known anything but love and security? Emma spotted me first, waving excitedly from the playground where the after-school program was held. Sam was on the swings, pumping his legs with the kind of fierce concentration he brought to everything he cared about. They looked so normal, so beautifully, heartbreakingly normal, and I had to grip the steering wheel to keep myself from falling apart right there in the car. "Mommy!" Emma called as she ran toward me, her backpack bouncing against her shoulders. Guess what happened in art class today? And just like that, I was back in mom mode, listening to her chatter about paint and paper and the butterfly she'd made that was currently crumpled in the bottom of her backpack. Sam bounded over with grass stains on his knees and a gap-toothed grin, talking excitedly about the kickball game at recess where he'd actually made it to second base. Normal. Everything was so perfectly, horribly normal. They had no idea that their entire world had shifted while they were learning about butterflies and playing kickball. They still believed in the safety and permanence of their family, and I was about to take that away from them. "Where's Daddy?" Sam asked as I buckled him into his car seat. "Is he coming home for dinner?" My hands froze on the seatbelt buckle. This was it. the moment I'd been dreading since I read David's letter that morning. "Actually, guys, we need to have a talk when we get home," I said, trying to keep my voice light and normal. "About Daddy." Emma's head snapped up in the rearview mirror. She was 8, old enough to sense when something was wrong, and the careful tone in my voice had caught her attention. "Is Daddy okay?" she asked, and the worry in her voice nearly broke me. "He's fine, sweetheart. We just need to talk." The drive home was quiet, except for the radio playing some cheerful pop song that felt obscene in the circumstances. Emma kept glancing at me in the mirror, her face creased with concern, while Sam hummed along to the music with blissful ignorance. At home, I settled them at the kitchen table with snacks and drinks, stalling for time while I tried to figure out how to begin. The letter was still on the floor where I'd dropped it that morning, and I quickly scooped it up and shoved it in a drawer. They didn't need to see that. They didn't need to know that their father had reduced the end of their family to a few paragraphs on expensive stationery. "Okay," I said, sitting down across from them. "I need to tell you something important about Daddy." Emma's eyes were wide and scared. Sam was still focused on his apple slices, but I could see him listening. "You know how sometimes grown-ups have to make really hard decisions?" I began. "Even when those decisions hurt people they love? Like when you wouldn't let me get a puppy?" Sam asked hopefully. "Sort of like that, but bigger," I said. "Daddy has decided that he needs to go live somewhere else for a while." The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Emma's face went very still, and Sam stopped chewing his apple. "Why?" Emma whispered. "God, how do you answer that?" "Because your father is selfish? Because he found someone younger and prettier and less complicated? Because apparently his happiness is more important than your security? Sometimes adults just need different things," I said lamely. "And Daddy thinks he needs to live in a different place right now. But he's coming back, right?" Sam's voice was small and uncertain. I closed my eyes, wishing I could lie to them, wishing I could promise them that their father would come to his senses and come home and everything would go back to normal. But I couldn't do that to them. False hope would only make the eventual truth more devastating. "I don't know, baby," I said. "I hope so, but I don't know." That's when Emma started crying. Not the dramatic, attention-seeking tears of childhood disappointment, but the quiet, desperate tears of someone whose world has just become uncertain and scary. Sam looked from her to me, his eyes filling up as he began to understand that something really, truly bad was happening. "Is it because of us?" Emma asked through her tears. "Did we do something wrong?" And that's when I lost it. Completely, utterly lost it. I pulled both of them into my arms and held them while we all cried together, their small bodies shaking against mine as they tried to process something that no child should ever have to understand. "No," I said fiercely, my voice rough with tears. "No, you did nothing wrong. Nothing. This is not about you, and it's not your fault. You are perfect and wonderful, and anyone would be lucky to be your parent." But even as I said the words, I could see the doubt in their eyes. Children always blame themselves when their parents' marriages fall apart. It's what they do. They think if only they'd been better, quieter, smarter, more lovable, maybe Daddy wouldn't have left. And David had done this to them. My kind, funny, brilliant children who brought me drawings they'd made at school and always remembered to feed the dog and still believed in Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy. David had looked at these perfect little people and decided his own happiness was more important than their emotional security. That night, after I'd gotten them to bed with extra stories and cuddles and reassurances that everything would be okay, even though I wasn't sure how, I sat in my dark living room and felt something shift inside me. The grief was still there, and the anger and the overwhelming fear about how I was going to manage as a single mother with no support system and not enough money. But underneath all of that was something new. Something cold and patient and very, very certain. David thought he could just walk away from the wreckage he'd created. He thought he could start his new life in Portland with Sarah and never look back, never face any consequences for what he'd done to his family. He thought he could reduce 12 years of marriage and 2 beautiful children to a $3,000 check and a brief letter of explanation. He was wrong about that. I didn't know how and I didn't know when, but somehow David was going to learn that actions have consequences. That you can't just destroy people's lives and walk away whistling. That the woman he'd discarded like yesterday's trash was stronger and smarter and more resourceful than he'd ever bothered to notice. I was going to make sure of it. The lawyer's office smelled like leather and disappointment. Patricia Hawkins was exactly what Lisa had promised, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who looked like she could cut glass with her smile. She listened to my story with the kind of professional detachment that probably came from hearing similar tales every day, taking notes in neat handwriting while I explained about the letter, the money, the complete abandonment. "How long has he been planning this?" she asked when I finished. "I don't know. Months, maybe. He'd been acting strange, but I thought it was just work stress." She flipped through the papers I'd brought. Bank statements, mortgage documents, David's employment information. The good news is that Oregon has pretty strict child support laws. "He can't just disappear and leave you with nothing." "But he already has," I pointed out. "What if he doesn't pay? What if he just ignores whatever court order you get?" Patricia's smile was razor thin. "Then we make his life very, very difficult. Wage garnishment, asset seizure, contempt of court charges. Men like your husband think they can just walk away from their responsibilities, but the law has ways of bringing them back to reality." It was satisfying to hear, but it didn't solve my immediate problem. Legal battles took time, and I had a mortgage payment due in 3 weeks. "What about the house?" I asked. "We'll fight to keep it. It's the family home, the children's primary residence." "But you need to be realistic, Rachel. Unless David's been hiding assets we don't know about, you might not be able to afford it on your salary alone." The thought of losing the house, of uprooting Emma and Sam from their home on top of everything else, made me feel sick. But Patricia was right. I had to be realistic. Over the next few weeks, I learned exactly how realistic I needed to be. David had been thorough in his planning. He'd quietly moved money out of our joint savings account over the past several months, leaving just enough to avoid raising suspicion, but taking enough to give himself a comfortable cushion for his new life. He'd canceled our joint credit cards. He'd even removed himself from the emergency contact lists at the kids' schools and doctors' offices. It was like he'd been systematically erasing himself from our lives for months, and I'd been too trusting, or too stupid, to notice. The worst part was how quickly everything started falling apart. The mortgage company didn't care that my husband had abandoned us. The credit card companies didn't care that I was suddenly a single mother with half the income I'd planned on. The world kept spinning, bills kept coming, and reality kept insisting that I figure out how to survive in circumstances I'd never imagined. I had to make choices I never thought I'd face. Cancel the kids' after-school activities. Stop buying name-brand groceries. Ignore the check engine light in my car and pray it wasn't anything serious. Each small compromise felt like another piece of my dignity being stripped away, and I knew David was probably living in some nice apartment in Portland, taking Sarah out to dinner and not thinking about the chaos he'd left behind. But through it all, that cold certainty in my chest kept growing. David thought he'd gotten away clean. He thought he could just disappear into his new life and never face any consequences for what he'd done to us. He was wrong. I started keeping track of things. Not for the divorce proceedings. Patricia was handling all of that, but for myself. I documented every missed phone call to the kids, every broken promise, every sign that David was settling into his new life while completely ignoring the children he'd left behind. I found his LinkedIn profile, updated with his new job at a Portland law firm. I found the apartment he was renting, a trendy place in the Pearl District that probably cost more per month than I made in 2. I wasn't stalking him exactly. I was just keeping informed, gathering information, understanding the shape of the life he'd chosen over us. And slowly, very slowly, an idea began to form. It started with a news article I came across while mindlessly scrolling through my phone late one night. A story about a woman who'd needed a kidney transplant and how difficult it was to find a compatible donor. The article mentioned that family members were often the best matches, and how tragic it was when families were estranged and couldn't help each other in medical emergencies. I almost scrolled past it, just another sad story in a world full of them. But something made me stop and read it again, and again. And suddenly I was thinking about David's family history, about his father who died of kidney disease when David was in college, about the genetic predisposition that ran in his family. David had always been proud of his health, almost smugly so. He worked out regularly, ate well, never smoked, barely drank. He was the kind of person who went to the doctor for annual checkups and followed all the recommendations, secure in the knowledge that good choices would protect him from the genetic lottery that had claimed his father. But genetics don't care about your good choices. And sometimes the very people you've discarded are the only ones who can save you. I didn't do anything with that thought at first. It was just an interesting coincidence, a dark little what if. that entertained me during the long, sleepless nights when I was trying to figure out how to pay bills and keep my family together. But as the weeks turned into months, and as David's absence became a permanent feature of our lives rather than a temporary crisis, that "what if" started to feel less like idle speculation and more like preparation. Because I was starting to understand something about revenge. It's not about the immediate satisfaction of striking back. That's just anger, and anger burns out fast. Real revenge is about patience, about understanding your target so completely that you can predict exactly when and how they'll be vulnerable, about positioning yourself so that when that moment comes, you're ready. And David, for all his careful planning and selfish calculation, had made one crucial mistake. He'd assumed that discarding his family meant he was free of us forever. He'd assumed that the woman he'd abandoned with 2 small children and a pile of bills would just fade quietly into the background of his past, a minor inconvenience from a life he'd outgrown. He'd forgotten that I knew him better than anyone else in the world. I knew his habits, his fears, his family history, his weaknesses. I knew that he was terrified of ending up like his father, dying slowly in a hospital bed while his organs failed. I knew that despite his bravado about starting fresh, he was fundamentally a cautious man who planned for every contingency. And I knew that no matter how thoroughly he thought he'd erased us from his life, there were some connections that couldn't be severed by moving to a different city and changing your phone number. Blood connections, genetic connections. The kind that only matter when everything else falls away and you're faced with your own mortality. So I waited, and I watched, and I prepared for the day when David would need something from the family he'd thrown away, and I would be there to remind him exactly what that abandonment had cost. 2 years passed before my patience was rewarded. 2 years of single motherhood, of scraping by financially, of watching my children learn to live with the disappointment of a father who remembered their birthdays sporadically and called even less frequently. 2 years of building a new life from the wreckage of the old one, stronger and more independent, but also harder, colder, more calculating than I'd ever imagined I could be. Emma was 10 now, Sam was 8, and they'd both learned to stop asking when Daddy was coming home. They'd adapted the way children do, accepting their new reality with a resilience that broke my heart and made me proud in equal measure. But I could see the scars David's abandonment had left. Emma's fierce independence that bordered on mistrust, Sam's occasional nightmares about people leaving and never coming back. I'd managed to keep the house barely by taking on freelance bookkeeping work in addition to my regular job. We weren't comfortable, but we were surviving. More than surviving, we were building something new together, the 3 of us. Something that didn't depend on David or his approval or his presence. But I never stopped watching. I never stopped gathering information about the life he'd built without us. And when the call came from David's mother, a woman who'd barely spoken to me since the divorce, I knew exactly what it meant. "Rachel," Martha's voice was strained, older than I remembered. "I'm sorry to bother you, but it's David. He's sick." I sat down slowly, my heart beginning to race with something that wasn't quite excitement but was definitely anticipation. "What kind of sick?" "Kidney disease. The doctors say it's genetic, probably the same thing that killed his father. He's going to need a transplant." There it was. The moment I'd been waiting for, preparing for, dreaming about in the dark hours when rage and grief had kept me awake. David needed something from us. David needed something that only family could provide. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, and I was pleased at how steady my voice sounded. "But I'm not sure why you're calling me." "The doctors say family members are usually the best matches for donors," Martha said, and I could hear the desperation she was trying to hide. "And with David's father gone, and me being too old, and David being an only child..." She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. I understood perfectly. After 2 years of complete silence, after 2 years of David ignoring his children and treating his ex-wife like she'd never existed, suddenly we were family again. Suddenly we mattered, because suddenly David needed something from us. "Have you talked to David about this?" I asked. Martha was quiet for a long moment. "He doesn't know I'm calling you. He's very proud, Rachel. You know how he is." Oh, I knew exactly how he was. David would rather die than ask me for help, would rather die than admit that he needed anything from the life he'd so carefully discarded. His pride was probably the only thing bigger than his selfishness, which made this absolutely perfect. "I see," I said. "Well, Martha, this is certainly unexpected. I'll need to think about it." Think about it. The desperation in her voice was clearer now. Rachel, he could die. Yes, I said calmly. I understand that. But you have to understand my position too. David made it very clear 2 years ago that we were no longer family. He cut all ties, abandoned his children, and started a new life. I'm not sure why that would change just because he needs something from us now. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for so long, I thought she might have hung up. Finally, Martha spoke, and her voice was small and broken. Please, Rachel. I know he hurt you. I know he made terrible choices. But he's still Emma and Sam's father. Is he? I asked. Because for the past 2 years, he's been a stranger who occasionally sends birthday cards and misses Christmas. The children barely remember him as a father. It was cruel, but it was also true. And after 2 years of watching my children learn to live with abandonment, after 2 years of being the only parent who showed up, who cared, who sacrificed for their well-being, I found I had very little sympathy for David's current predicament. I'll think about it, I repeated. But I can't make any promises. This is a family decision, and David chose to remove himself from this family. After I hung up, I sat in my quiet house and felt something that might have been satisfaction spreading through my chest. It was happening. After 2 years of patience, of watching and waiting and preparing, the moment had finally arrived. David needed me. David, who had calculated the destruction of our marriage with such cold precision, who had abandoned his children without a backward glance, who had started his new life like his old one had never mattered at all. David needed something from the family he'd discarded, and I was going to make sure he understood exactly what that meant. The call from Martha changed everything, but not in the way she'd hoped. For 2 years, I'd been building toward this moment without even realizing it. 2 years of watching David live his perfect new life while his children learned to stop asking about him. 2 years of financial struggle and single parenthood while he played house with Sarah in Portland. 2 years of being discarded like yesterday's trash while he enjoyed the freedom of a man with no responsibilities. And now he needed me. Not wanted me, not missed me, not regretted losing me. Needed me? There's a difference, and it's everything. I didn't call Martha back right away. Instead, I did what I'd become very good at over the past 2 years. I researched. I spent hours online learning about kidney disease, transplant procedures, compatibility testing, and survival rates. I read medical journals and patient forums and everything I could find about what David was facing. The picture that emerged was both better and worse than I'd expected. Better because kidney disease, while serious, was very treatable with the right donor. Worse because without a transplant, David was looking at years of dialysis, declining health, and eventually death. The 5-year survival rate for people on dialysis was about 50%. Not great odds for a man who was only 42. But with a compatible kidney from a living donor, the survival rates jumped to over 90%. David could live a completely normal life, probably outlive me by decades, go back to his job and his girlfriend and his carefully constructed new existence like this whole crisis had never happened. If he could find a compatible donor. I also researched David's new life, because I'd gotten very good at that too. His LinkedIn showed he was doing well at the Portland firm, probably making even more money than he had here. I found pictures of him and Sarah at charity events and wine tastings, looking happy and carefree and blissfully unaware that his genetic time bomb was already ticking. She was even prettier than I remembered, with the kind of effortless beauty that comes from never having carried children or lost sleep over mortgage payments. They looked good together. Successful, attractive, unencumbered by the messy realities of family life. Everything David had wanted when he'd decided we weren't enough for him anymore. I wondered if Sarah knew about his family history, if she understood what she was signing up for when she'd chosen to build a life with a man whose father had died of the same disease that was now threatening him. Somehow, I doubted David had been quite that honest about his genetic baggage, but that wasn't my problem. My problem was deciding what to do with the power that had just landed in my lap. 3 days after Martha's call, my phone rang again. This time it was David himself. I almost didn't answer. Seeing his name on the caller ID after 2 years of silence made my hands shake and my heart race. But I'd been preparing for this moment, and I wasn't going to let it catch me off guard. "Hello, David." My voice was steady, professional, like he was a stranger calling about business. "Rachel." He sounded different. Older, maybe, or tired. I heard my mother called you?" "She did." Silence stretched between us, filled with 2 years of hurt and anger and all the things we'd never said to each other. Finally, David cleared his throat. I want you to know that I didn't ask her to do that. I figured, this isn't. I never wanted to drag you into this. The casual cruelty of that statement took my breath away. Drag me into this. Like his health crisis was an inconvenience he was trying to spare me from, rather than the consequence of choices he'd made. Like I was some distant acquaintance who might be bothered by his problems, rather than the mother of his children and the woman who'd loved him for 12 years. How considerate of you, I said, and I could hear the ice in my own voice. David must have heard it too, because when he spoke again, his tone was more careful. Look, I know things ended badly between us. Ended badly. That was one way to put it. Another way would be to say that he'd abandoned his family in the most cowardly way possible, but I suppose David's version sounded better. I know you have every right to hate me. Do I? I thought. Because hate seemed like too small a word for what I felt. Hate was passionate, immediate, burning. What I felt was colder than that, more calculated. What I felt was the kind of steady, patient anger that builds over years of being dismissed and discarded and forgotten. I don't hate you, David, I said, and it was true. I don't feel anything for you at all anymore. Another silence. Then, I'm sorry to hear that. He wasn't, though. I could hear it in his voice. Relief, actually. Relief that I wasn't going to be emotional or difficult about this. Relief that he could treat this like a business transaction instead of a conversation between two people who used to love each other. The thing is, he continued, the doctors want to test family members for compatibility, and with my father gone and my mother too old to donate. He trailed off, waiting for me to fill in the blanks. To volunteer myself for testing, maybe, or at least acknowledge that I understood what he was asking for without making him actually ask. But I'd learned something about power over the past 2 years. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is make someone say exactly what they want from you. What are you asking me, David? He cleared his throat again. I was hoping you might consider getting tested. As a potential donor. There it was, the ask. The moment when the man who had abandoned his family without a backward glance was asking that same family to save his life. I see, I said. And what makes you think I'd be willing to do that? Well, we have children together. And despite everything that happened between us, I thought... You thought what? I thought you might still care enough to help me live. The assumption in that statement was breathtaking. Despite everything that happened between us, as if our divorce had been a mutual decision, a sad but amicable parting of ways, as if he hadn't disappeared from our lives like we'd never mattered to him at all. That's interesting, I said, because for the past 2 years you've acted like you don't care whether I live or die. Or whether your children do, for that matter. That's not fair, Rachel. Isn't it? The anger was starting to leak through my careful composure. When was the last time you called Emma? When was the last time you asked Sam about school? When was the last time you sent child support without being threatened by lawyers? I've been dealing with this illness. For how long, David? Because according to your mother, you've been sick for months. Months when you could have reached out to your children, could have prepared them for what was happening, could have acted like the father they deserve instead of the stranger you've become. He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was smaller, more uncertain. I didn't want to worry them. You didn't want to worry them. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. You abandoned them, David. You walked out of their lives without explanation and left them to wonder what they'd done wrong. But you didn't want to worry them about being sick? It wasn't like that. What was it like then? Help me understand. Help me understand how you could look at Emma and Sam and decide that your happiness was more important than their security. Help me understand how you could promise to love and protect them and then just disappear. I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line, but he didn't answer. What could he say? That he'd fallen out of love with being a father the same way he'd fallen out of love with being a husband? That responsibility had become inconvenient when Sarah came along with her pretty smile and her uncomplicated life. I made mistakes, he said finally. I know that. But Rachel, I'm dying. And there it was. The nuclear option. The trump card he thought would end the conversation and make me fall in line like a good ex-wife who understood her place in the hierarchy of his needs. But I wasn't that woman anymore. 2 years of single parenthood had burned that woman away, leaving someone harder and more pragmatic in her place. Someone who understood that guilt was just another form of manipulation when it came from a man who'd never felt guilty enough to actually change his behavior. I'm sorry to hear that, I said, and my voice was steady again. That must be very frightening for you. So you'll get tested? The hope in his voice was almost pathetic, like he'd expected this to be difficult but not impossible, like he'd thought he could wear down my resistance with the right combination of self-pity and desperation. I didn't say that. Silence. David, I want you to understand something. I continued. 2 years ago, you made a choice. You decided that your family wasn't worth staying for, that your children weren't worth the inconvenience of being their father, that the life we'd built together was something you wanted to escape from. That choice had consequences. Your children learned that they couldn't count on you. I learned that 12 years of marriage meant nothing to you. We learned that when things got difficult or boring or just not exciting enough, you would leave. Now you're in a difficult situation, and you want us to forget all of that. You want us to pretend that the past 2 years didn't happen, that you haven't been absent from your children's lives, that you haven't treated us like we were disposable. Rachel, I'm not finished. My voice was sharp enough to cut through his interruption. You want me to undergo surgery, to give you a piece of my body, to risk my own health and potentially my life so that you can go back to the life you chose over us, so that you can continue being the father who sends birthday cards sometimes and the ex-husband who acts like I don't exist. And you want me to do this out of what? Lingering affection for a man who treated me like garbage? Concern for someone who has shown no concern for his own children? The silence stretched so long I wondered if he'd hung up. Finally, his voice came through, smaller and more desperate than I'd ever heard it. What do you want from me? What did I want? I'd been asking myself that question for 2 years, and now, finally, I knew the answer. I want you to understand what you threw away, I said. I want you to face the consequences of your choices. And I want you to know that the family you abandoned doesn't owe you anything anymore. But I'll think about getting tested, I said, cutting him off. But not because you asked. Not because you're dying. Not because you think I should still care about what happens to you. Then why? Because Emma and Sam might want to know that they tried to save their father even after he stopped being one. I hung up before he could respond. The testing process took 3 weeks. 3 weeks of blood draws and medical consultations and increasingly intrusive questions about my health history and lifestyle. 3 weeks of David calling every few days to ask about the results, his voice getting more strained and desperate each time. I let most of those calls go to voicemail. The results, when they came, were exactly what I'd expected them to be. I was a perfect match. Better than perfect, actually. The doctor explained that my kidney tissue was so compatible with David's that the chances of rejection were almost zero. It was like we'd been made for each other, which had a certain poetic irony that wasn't lost on me. This is incredibly good news for your ex-husband, Dr. Martinez told me during the consultation where we reviewed the results. With this level of compatibility, his body will accept the transplant like it's his own organ. He could live a completely normal life. What about the risks to me? I asked. Living donor nephrectomy is a major surgery, but it's very safe. The risks are minimal and you can live a completely normal life with 1 kidney. Some donors report feeling even healthier afterward, knowing they've saved someone's life. Saved someone's life. The phrase stuck with me as I drove home from the appointment. I had the power to save David's life. The man who had discarded me like yesterday's trash now depended on me for his very survival. The symmetry of it was almost beautiful. I didn't call David with the results. Instead, I did something I'd been planning for weeks. I called Sarah. I'd found her number through a process that probably bordered on stalking, but felt more like research to me. Social media had made it surprisingly easy to piece together the details of their life together, the apartment they shared, the friends they had in common, the routines that made up their day-to-day existence. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice bright and professional. Sarah Caldwell. Hello, Sarah. This is Rachel Morrison, David's ex-wife. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear her breathing. Finally, hi. I'm calling because I think we need to talk. I don't think that's a good idea. David needs a kidney transplant, I said, ignoring her discomfort. I'm sure you know that. Yes. Her voice was cautious now, uncertain. I'm a compatible donor. In fact, I'm a perfect match. Another silence. I thought you should know that, since you're the one who'll be taking care of him afterward, if I decide to go through with the surgery. What do you mean, if? I mean, I haven't decided yet whether David's life is worth risking my own for. I could hear her sharp intake of breath. You can't be serious. I'm completely serious. My voice was calm, matter of fact. David abandoned his family 2 years ago. He cut all contact with his children, left me with bills I couldn't afford, and started a new life like we'd never existed. Now he needs something from us, and I'm trying to decide whether he deserves it. He's dying. Yes, I'm aware of that. How can you even hesitate? He's the father of your children. Is he? I asked. Because for the past 2 years, he's been a stranger who occasionally sends birthday cards. The children barely remember him as a father. That doesn't mean you should let him die, doesn't it? I let the question hang in the air for a moment. Tell me, Sarah, what do you think David would do if our situations were reversed? If I were dying and needed something from him that he could provide at great personal cost and risk? She didn't answer, but I could hear her thinking. Because she knew David, maybe not as well as I did, but well enough to understand what kind of man he was when it came to inconvenient obligations. I'll make you a deal, I said finally. I'll give David my kidney, and in return, I want something from both of you. What? I want David to be a father to his children. Real involvement, not just guilt money and birthday cards. I want regular visitation, phone calls, participation in their lives. I want him to act like Emma and Sam matter to him. And I want you to understand what you're really getting into with him. Because David is very good at making himself seem charming and devoted when it serves his purposes. But when things get difficult, when life gets messy and complicated, he runs. He abandoned his children once. What makes you think he won't abandon yours? We don't have children, Sarah said quietly. Not yet. But what happens when you do? What happens when David gets bored with family life again? When the novelty wears off and responsibility starts feeling like a burden? What happens when some new Sarah comes along, younger and prettier and less complicated than you? That's not going to happen. That's what I thought too. The conversation ended without any promises from Sarah, but I could tell I'd planted seeds of doubt. And that was enough for now. That evening, I sat Emma and Sam down for another difficult conversation. They were older now, 10 and 8, old enough to understand more complex emotions and situations, old enough to have opinions about their father that went beyond simple hurt and confusion. I need to tell you something about Daddy, I began, using the same gentle tone I'd used 2 years ago when I'd first explained his absence. Is he coming home? Sam asked hopefully, and my heart broke a little. Even after all this time, even after all the missed birthdays and forgotten promises, he still hoped. No, sweetheart, but he's sick and he needs our help. I explained about the kidney disease, about the transplant, about the fact that I was a compatible donor. I tried to make it age-appropriate without being dishonest, because they deserved to understand what was happening in their family. Are you going to help him? Emma asked. She was looking at me with those serious brown eyes that always made her seem older than her years. I don't know yet, I said honestly. I wanted to talk to you both about it first. Would it hurt you? Sam asked, climbing into my lap like he used to when he was smaller. It's surgery, so yes, it would hurt. But I would be okay afterward. Then you should do it, he said with the simple moral clarity that children possess. Because even if Daddy left us, we should still help him. But Emma was frowning, working through more complex emotions. Why should we help him when he didn't help us? She asked. When we needed him after he left, he wasn't there. When you were sad and had to work all the time and we didn't have enough money, where was he? Out of the mouths of babes, Emma had hit on exactly the question I'd been wrestling with for weeks. Why should we help someone who had shown us no consideration when we needed help? Those are very good questions, I told her. And I don't have easy answers. But I want you both to think about something. This isn't really about Daddy. This is about who we want to be as people. Do we want to be the kind of people who help others even when they haven't helped us? Or do we want to be the kind of people who only care about others when they care about us first? Emma considered this seriously. Can't we be both? Can't we help him but also be mad at him? Yes, I said, pulling her closer. We can absolutely be both. That night, after I'd tucked them into bed with extra hugs and reassurances, I sat in my quiet living room and made my decision. Not the decision about the surgery. I'd already made that one weeks ago if I was being honest with myself. But the decision about how I was going to handle everything that came after, because I was going to give David my kidney. Not out of love or forgiveness or any lingering affection for the man who'd abandoned us. I was going to do it because Emma and Sam deserved to know that they'd tried to save their father, and because I deserved to hold the moral high ground in this situation. But I was going to do it on my terms. And David was going to understand exactly what this gift cost and exactly what it meant about the woman he'd thrown away. I called him the next morning. Rachel? He sounded surprised to hear from me, and underneath that, hopeful. I've decided to do the surgery. The relief in his voice was immediate and overwhelming. Oh God, Rachel, thank you. Thank you so much. I can't tell you how much this means. I'm not finished, I said, cutting through his gratitude. I have conditions. Silence. What kind of conditions? First, you're going to start being a real father to Emma and Sam. Not just child support payments and occasional phone calls. Real involvement, regular visitation, participation in their school events, birthday parties, holidays, all of it. Rachel, you know the distance makes that difficult. Then you'll figure it out. You managed to disappear completely when it suited your purposes. Now you can manage to show up when your children need you. He was quiet for a moment. Okay, what else? Second, you're going to pay for Emma's orthodontics and Sam's soccer camp and all the other things they've gone without, because you decided your child support obligations were optional. I've been paying child support, the bare minimum required by court order, and not always on time. That's going to change. Fine. What else? Third, you're going to understand that this gift comes with no expectations. I'm not doing this because I've forgiven you, or because I want us to be friends, or because I think this makes us even. I'm doing this because your children asked me to, and because I want to be able to look at myself in the mirror afterward. I understand. Do you? Because here's what's going to happen, David. I'm going to give you my kidney, and you're going to live. You're going to go back to your job and your girlfriend and your carefully reconstructed life. And every day for the rest of that life, you're going to wake up knowing that the woman you discarded like garbage is the reason you're alive. My voice was steady, matter of fact, like I was explaining a business transaction, because in a way, that's exactly what this was. Every time you look in the mirror, every time you go for a run, every time you make love to Sarah or laugh at a joke or taste your favorite food, you're going to remember that you can do those things because I chose to save you. Not because you deserved it. Not because you earned it, but because I am a better person than you are. The silence stretched for so long I thought he might have hung up. Finally, his voice came through, smaller and more broken than I'd ever heard it. I know I don't deserve this. No, I agreed. You don't, but I'm grateful. More grateful than I can possibly express. Save your gratitude. I don't want it. Then what do you want from me? I want you to be the father Emma and Sam deserve. I want you to keep your promises for once in your life. And I want you to remember every single day what it cost someone else to keep you alive. The surgery was scheduled for a Thursday in November, 3 months after that first phone call from Martha. 3 months of medical consultations and psychological evaluations and endless paperwork. 3 months of David calling regularly to check on the process, his voice getting stronger and more hopeful each time as the reality of his survival became more certain. I let Emma and Sam visit him in the hospital the day before the surgery. They were nervous, unsure how to interact with this man who was their father, but also a stranger. David was nervous too, I could tell, uncertain how to talk to children he'd essentially abandoned 2 years ago. But they were polite to each other, carefully so. Emma showed him a drawing she'd made at school. Sam told him about soccer and his loose tooth and the book report he was working on. David listened with the kind of focused attention that felt performative, like he was trying to prove he cared rather than actually caring. Still, it was a start, and when they hugged him goodbye, tentatively and awkwardly, I saw tears in his eyes. "Thank you," he said to me as we prepared to leave, "for bringing them, for letting them see me. They're your children," I said simply. "They have a right to know their father, even if their father has chosen not to know them." The surgery itself was routine, as much as any major operation can be routine. I woke up in recovery with a line of fire across my abdomen and the certainty that I'd done something irreversible. Not just the surgery, though that scar would be with me forever, but something larger. I'd closed a chapter of my life in the most final way possible. David's surgeon found me in my room the next afternoon, still groggy from pain medication, but alert enough to understand what he was telling me. The transplant was a complete success. "Doctor," Peterson said with a smile, "your kidney is functioning perfectly in David's body. It's like it was meant to be there." Meant to be there. I suppose there was a certain poetry in that. The organ that had been part of me for 38 years was now part of the man who'd shared my life for 12 of them. Biology had connected us in a way that divorce papers couldn't sever. "He's asking to see you, Doctor," Peterson continued, "but only if you're feeling up to it." I wasn't really. The pain medication made everything fuzzy around the edges, and I felt hollowed out in a way that went beyond the physical surgery, but I needed to see this through to the end. David's room was 2 floors up from mine, in the transplant recovery unit. He looked smaller than I remembered, diminished by the hospital bed and the tubes and monitors surrounding him. But his color was already better, and when he saw me being wheeled in, his eyes filled with tears. "Rachel." His voice was hoarse from the breathing tube, but stronger than it had been in weeks. "I don't know how to thank you. I told you not to try." But he pressed on anyway, words tumbling out like he'd been rehearsing them. "What you've done, what you've given me. I know I don't deserve it. I know I've been a terrible husband and a worse father. But I want you to know that I'm going to do better. I'm going to be better. For Emma and Sam, I mean. I'm going to keep my promises this time." I looked at him lying there in that hospital bed, sustained by my organ, kept alive by my choice, and I felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not vindication, not even pity. Just a vast emptiness where all my feelings for him used to live. "I hope so," I said finally. "Because if you disappoint them again, if you make them promises you don't keep, if you break their hearts the way you broke mine, then this gift will have been wasted. And David, the kidney I've given you is healthy and strong. It should last you the rest of your life, which could be 30 or 40 more years if you take care of yourself. That's 30 or 40 years of birthdays and Christmases and soccer games and school plays that you chose to miss. 30 or 40 years of chances to be the father Emma and Sam needed you to be. I understand. Do you? Because every day you're alive from now on is a day I gave you. Every breath you take, every heartbeat, every moment of joy or love or simple existence, that's my gift to you. Not because you deserved it, but because your children deserved a chance to save their father." I could see him trying to process what I was saying, trying to understand the weight of what had just happened between us. But I wasn't sure he could, really. David had always been good at taking what he needed from people without fully grasping what it cost them to give it. "Don't waste it," I said as the nurse prepared to wheel me back to my room. "Don't waste the life I've given you." The recovery process took 6 weeks. 6 weeks of careful movement and restricted activity, and learning to live with the knowledge that a piece of me was now keeping someone else alive. The physical healing was straightforward. I was young and healthy, and my remaining kidney adjusted quickly to handling the full workload. The emotional healing was more complicated. I'd expected to feel satisfaction, maybe even triumph. I'd won after all. I'd held David's life in my hands and chosen to save him, not out of love or forgiveness, but as the ultimate demonstration of my moral superiority. I'd forced him to face the consequences of his choices while proving that I was a better person than he was. But victory felt different than I'd imagined it would. Emptier, more final. Maybe that's what revenge really is, not the sweet satisfaction of striking back, but the hollow realization that getting even doesn't actually make you feel even. It just makes you aware of how much you've lost in the process of trying to balance the scales. David kept his promises mostly. He started calling the kids every Sunday, awkward conversations that gradually became more natural as they all learned how to be family again, albeit a different kind of family than they'd been before. He came for Emma's birthday in January, bearing expensive gifts and genuine smiles, and what seemed like real interest in her life. He paid for Sam's soccer camp and Emma's braces without being asked. He sent Christmas presents that showed he'd been paying attention to their interests, rather than just grabbing random items from a toy store. It wasn't perfect. How could it be after 2 years of absence? But it was real effort, real change. The kind of consistency that Emma and Sam had never gotten from him before. And every time he showed up, every time he kept a promise, every time he acted like the father they deserved, I knew that my kidney was what made it possible. My sacrifice, my choice, my gift of life that allowed him to be present for theirs. Sarah left him in March. I heard about it through Emma, who mentioned casually that Daddy's girlfriend had moved out of their apartment. When I pressed gently for details, she shrugged with the studied indifference of a 10-year-old who'd learned not to get too invested in adult relationships. Daddy said she decided she wasn't ready for kids, Emma said. But he told us it's okay because he has us, and we're the most important thing anyway. I wondered if Sarah had remembered our conversation from months ago, if she'd started seeing the cracks in David's charming facade that I'd pointed out. Or maybe she'd just realized that dating a man with serious health issues and 2 children and an ex-wife who'd literally given him life was more complicated than she'd bargained for. Either way, I felt a small, petty satisfaction that David's perfect new life hadn't stayed perfect for long. The universe had its own sense of balance, apparently. He called me in April, 6 months after the surgery. "I wanted to thank you again," he said without preamble. "The 6-month checkup went perfectly. The kidney is functioning like it's been there my whole life. I'm glad to hear that. And I wanted you to know that I've been thinking about what you said, about not wasting the life you gave me. Have you? I've been going to therapy, he said, and there was something vulnerable in his voice that I'd never heard before. Trying to understand why I made the choices I did, why I hurt the people I was supposed to love most. This was new. The David I'd known had never been one for introspection or emotional growth. He'd been more likely to rationalize his behavior than examine it. That's good, I said, and meant it. I know I can't undo the damage I caused, he continued. I know I can't give you back those 2 years or make up for what I put Emma and Sam through. But I want you to know that I understand now what I threw away. What I lost when I lost all of you. What I gave up when I chose my own immediate happiness over everything that really mattered. I was quiet for a long moment, processing this new version of David, one who seemed capable of genuine remorse and self-awareness. Why are you telling me this? I asked finally. Because I realized that I never really apologized. Not properly. I said I was sorry, but I never acknowledged what I was actually sorry for. He took a deep breath. Rachel, I'm sorry for being a coward. I'm sorry for choosing the easy way out instead of fighting for our marriage when it got difficult. I'm sorry for abandoning Emma and Sam when they needed their father most. I'm sorry for treating you like you were disposable instead of recognizing that you were the best person in my life. I'm sorry for making you feel like our 12 years together meant nothing to me, because they meant everything. You were everything. And I threw it all away because I was selfish and scared and too proud to admit that I was the problem, not you. The words hung in the air between us, and I realized I was crying. Not from sadness or renewed affection, but from something like relief. For 2 years, I'd carried the weight of wondering if I'd been enough, if I'd failed somehow, if there was something I could have done differently to make him stay. His apology didn't change what had happened, but it lifted that weight off my shoulders. It confirmed what I'd suspected but never quite believed, that his leaving had been about his own failures, not mine. Thank you, I said when I could speak again. For saying that? I should have said it 2 years ago. Yes, you should have. We were both quiet for a moment. Then David spoke again, his voice careful. I know this doesn't change anything between us. I know we can't go back, and I'm not asking to try. But I want you to know that I understand now what I lost. And I understand that the fact that I'm alive to have this conversation at all is because you're a better person than I ever was. Every day I wake up, I remember that. Every day I'm grateful, not just for the kidney, but for the reminder of what real love looks like, what real sacrifice looks like. You loved me and Emma and Sam enough to give me life even after I'd thrown your love away. That's not something I'll ever be able to repay. I don't want you to repay it, I said. I want you to live up to it. I want you to be worthy of the gift you've been given, not just the kidney, but the second chance with your children. I'm trying to be, I know, and they know too. After we hung up, I sat in my quiet kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd read his goodbye letter 2.5 years ago, and reflected on how much had changed. The house was still mine, the mortgage finally manageable thanks to David's consistent support payments. Emma and Sam were thriving, more confident and secure now that they had both parents actively involved in their lives, even if those parents lived in different states. And me? I was different too. Harder in some ways, more self-reliant, less trusting of promises and declarations of love, but also stronger, more certain of my own worth and capabilities, more aware of what I was willing to tolerate and what I absolutely was not. The scar from the surgery had faded to a thin line across my abdomen, barely visible unless you knew where to look. But I knew it was there, and I knew what it represented. Not just the kidney I'd given away, but the end of one version of myself and the beginning of another. I'd set out to get revenge on David, to make him understand what he'd thrown away and what his choices had cost. But somewhere along the way, the revenge had transformed into something else. Not forgiveness. I wasn't sure I'd ever fully forgive him for what he'd done to Emma and Sam, but something like resolution, closure, the certainty that I'd acted according to my own moral code, regardless of whether he deserved it. David had needed my kidney to live, and I'd given it to him. Not because I loved him anymore, not because I'd forgiven him, but because my children had asked me to, and because I wanted to be able to live with the person I saw in the mirror every morning. In the end, that was the best revenge of all, being so secure in my own integrity that his opinion of me no longer mattered. He would live the rest of his life knowing that the woman he'd discarded as worthless had literally kept him alive. He would wake up every morning in whatever life he built for himself with the knowledge that his ex-wife was a better person than he'd ever been. And I would wake up every morning knowing that when tested, when pushed to my absolute limit by betrayal and abandonment and the deepest kind of hurt, I'd still chosen to be the person I wanted to be, rather than the person circumstances tried to make me. David had abandoned our family, but I'd refused to abandon my own humanity. He'd chosen selfishness, but I'd chosen sacrifice. He'd chosen the easy path, but I'd chosen the right one. In the end, that wasn't revenge at all. It was simply justice, the kind that comes not from striking back, but from rising above. The kind that leaves you not bitter and consumed with anger, but free and clear and completely, finally whole. 3 years after the surgery, David remarried. Not Sarah, she was long gone by then, but a kindergarten teacher named Lisa who seemed genuinely kind and had 2 children of her own from a previous marriage. Emma and Sam liked her, which was what mattered most to me. At Emma's middle school graduation, I sat 3 rows behind David and his new family, watching my daughter walk across that stage with the confidence and poise of someone who knew she was loved and supported by both her parents. Different parents than she'd started with, in a different configuration than we'd originally planned, but parents who showed up nonetheless. After the ceremony, David approached me with Lisa and her kids in tow. He looked good, healthy and settled in a way he hadn't been during those final years of our marriage. "Rachel," he said, and his voice carried the easy warmth of someone who'd made peace with his past. "I wanted to introduce you to Lisa." She was younger than me, but not dramatically so, with laugh lines around her eyes and the kind of practical beauty that comes from someone who spends her days with children. She smiled at me with genuine warmth, not the careful politeness I might have expected from a second wife meeting the first. "It's so nice to finally meet you," Lisa said. "David talks about you often." "Good things, I hope," I said, and I meant it lightly, but David's response was serious. "Always good things?" he said, looking directly at me. "I tell Lisa that you're the reason I'm here at all. In every sense." We talked for a few more minutes about nothing important. Emma's plans for high school, Sam's latest soccer achievements, the logistics of summer visitation. Normal divorced parent conversation, cordial and focused on the children we shared. But as they walked away, Lisa's kids chattering excitedly about the graduation ceremony, and Emma and Sam running ahead to compare notes with their friends, David turned back to me one more time. "Thank you," he said simply, "for everything." I knew he wasn't just talking about the kidney anymore. He was talking about the choice to save him despite what he'd done to us, the choice to let him back into his children's lives, the choice to model grace and forgiveness even when he hadn't earned it, the choice to be better than the worst thing that had happened to me. "You're welcome," I said, and for the first time in 3 years, I truly meant it. That night, as I tucked Sam into bed and kissed Emma goodnight, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought us all to this point. David's betrayal had shattered our family, but it hadn't destroyed us. His illness had given me the opportunity for the perfect revenge, but I'd chosen something better than revenge. I'd chosen to be the kind of person my children could be proud of, the kind of person I could be proud of, the kind of person who understood that sometimes the greatest victory comes not from making others pay for their mistakes, but from refusing to let their mistakes define you. My kidney was keeping David alive, but that wasn't the real gift I'd given him. The real gift was the example of what love looks like when it's not selfish or conditional or dependent on being loved back. The example of what it means to choose forgiveness, not because someone deserves it, but because you deserve the peace that comes from letting go of anger. He would carry that example with him for the rest of his life, the life I'd made possible. And maybe, just maybe, it would make him a better man, a better father, a better husband to the woman who'd been brave enough to love him despite his history. That was worth more than any revenge I could have devised. That was the kind of legacy I wanted to leave for my children. Not that their mother had been cruel when she had the chance, but that she'd been kind instead. Not that she'd chosen bitterness, but that she'd chosen grace. In the end, David had needed my kidney to live, but I'd needed to give it to him to truly be free.